Mega projects, planned and unplanned, are huge in cost and huge in scope, but they present unique challenges in leadership, strategic planning, implementation, and resiliency. Our panel is going to talk about all of that and more. I'm really happy to be the one to moderate that panel because it links up with my career experiences. At Ford Motor Company, I was involved in product design, scientific research, government affairs, strategy, global markets. When I left there, I went to Wayne State University and was a founding director of the Institute on Competitiveness. In that role, I had the real pleasure of creating, co-producing, and hosting a television series on Detroit Public Television, Leaders on Leadership. I got to interview a new CEO every week about leadership. All of those experiences feed right into what we're going to be talking about today. Let me introduce our panel. Virginia Greiman teaches international development and project finance at Boston University and business transactions at Boston Law. She's had senior government positions around the world, and she was the deputy counsel on the infamous Miss Dig project in Boston, $15 billion. And apropos to this panel, she literally wrote the book on mega projects published by Wiley. Charles Mano is CEO of Instant Access Networks. IAN integrates services from participating companies offering EMP pulse protected communications and energy grids. He's the chair emeritus of InfraGard's Special Interest Group on EMP in our digital world. Dr. Eric Rebentish is a research associate at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Center for Socio-Technical Systems Research. He was the editor-in-chief for the book Integrating Program Management and Systems Engineering, published by Wiley, in partnership with the Project Management Institute and the International Council on Systems Engineering. John Thomas is the founder of John Thomas Associates, LLC, specializing in management and technical consulting in markets worldwide. His past experience includes vice president and chief systems engineer with Booz Allen Hamilton, and 25 years with the U.S. Air Force. Thank you for that. As past president of Incosi, he was instrumental in creating the alliance that resulted in the book that Eric edited and Jenny was part of. Thanks for being here. Please welcome our panel. In a speech, Jenny once described mega projects as destroyers and creators of capital, which is a phrase I like. To get us started, maybe each of you could just take a minute or two and tell us how you define a mega project in a more working level term, and maybe give us an example. Eric, would you like to start?
Sure, Larry. I equate mega projects with programs in other sectors. Mega projects would be, of course, big, but they have complex stakeholder structures. There are a lot of people that are involved. They would be comprise multiple individual projects that provide deliverables, but they have a diverse benefit stream that plays out over a lifetime that could span many, many years. So that would be the way I think of mega projects.
Jenny.
I think of them as a large public undertaking with a lot of political attention and a lot of large-scale policy making. And mega projects can cut across industries and countries. They can do great things. Our International Space Station is an example of a mega project that's involved in research and development. Many times we think of mega projects as infrastructure, and certainly the projects I've been involved with, many of them have been to develop new infrastructures, but also to help transform the communities and cities in which they are built. So that's how I think of a mega project.
Well, I think of two different kinds of mega projects. Smaller ones that I've been involved in was like creating the infrastructure for a competitive local exchange carrier, where you're simultaneously doing about 100 construction projects, building class 4 and 5 switches and ATM switches, building software for the front and back office, doing everything involved in a company like that in coordination with multiple other companies and investment groups. But what I'm really interested in is the mega project of mega projects, where you think of things like our power grid, which is something like that, evolving over decades with multiple companies, multiple jurisdictions, federal, state, and local, where they were evolving as systems of systems without even awareness of each other to a very great extent, and just marginally managed by federal folks and state folks in that mix. And that's something that's intriguing because of where it leads us as a society. We all are benefited or hurt by the success or drawbacks of what eventually become the outcomes of that work.
John?
Well, I think of mega projects as delivering value through the implementation of a system. And in the most simple way that I think of a system, I think of a system as built from parts that interact with each other. And the value comes from not any one of those parts, but the parts and their interaction. In this context, if you build on what you've already heard in the definitions, the emphasis here is the parts could be built by many different teams that have many different cultural perspectives. The value gets delivered to people who are different political objectives, different technical objectives, different sociological objectives. That is a very complex, difficult problem.
It was interesting to me that size of the project was almost marginally mentioned. You were talking about all these other moving parts. Is that a fair assessment of what I heard? Size isn't the totally determining factor on a mega project.
No, it never really should be, because mega projects can be built in very poor countries, and the gross national product may be smaller than the cost of the project. So cost is really not a critical factor, although there are some government agencies that have defined mega projects, like the Federal Highway Administration defines a mega project as over $1 billion. But I think that's misleading, because today, as all our panelists have mentioned, it's all about the complexity, working with people from different backgrounds, different missions, different incentives, and learning from each other. I think of them as very interdisciplinary.
Okay. Chuck, I think you told me when we were talking the other day that you saw mega projects as a combination problem and opportunity. That's an intriguing phrase. Can you expand on that?
Well, there's a sense in which a really large project, by definition, is the result of someone's dream or ambition to accomplish something wonderful. And at the same time, that requires somebody to do what everyone else thought was impossible. And so it requires a lot of creativity. And for those who buy into that as stakeholders, you wind up having to identify what I think those are. Somebody's going to have to say, like anything else, what's in it for us? And why do we care? And why should we take that risk on? And what can we do to minimize that risk? But then you have the follow-up responsibility to sort of manage all of that, even though you don't have full control of all those other pieces. But you do try to negotiate the collaboration so that it actually works, and works on time, on budget, and delivers the value you expect.
Well, once you have this big vision for what the mega project's going to be, with all these moving parts, how do you get a common vision across all the moving parts?
If you're asking any of us, maybe we should go first.
Well, I'm happy to say you get it by listening first and by learning from the other members of your team, and by sharing ideas. And that's a very important part of the success of a mega project, that you're bringing together people with different backgrounds, different perspectives, points of view. Many times you have stakeholders with different interests. But it is very important to sit down and share and understand and respect each other's views, because over time it's essential to build consensus on a mega project.
I moderated another panel this morning, and the topic was complex systems. Mm-hmm. Is a mega project always a complex system, and vice versa?
I think that It probably is a complex system, and we can get into the difference between complicated and complex. But I think mega projects fit in the complex category because they have a lot of parts, but they also are subject to a changeable environment. There are things that you cannot predict, and therefore there are going to be some emergent properties. And so it's really important for, in addition to the things that Ginny was just talking about, having a management team that is focused on collaboration and communication, to also be adaptable and able to improvise to meet the emergent challenges that may come up in a mega project.
Can you expand on your comment that complicated is different than complexity?
Complicated typically is something that we can understand all of the parts. We can understand most, if not all, of the interactions that occur within the system. And we can create plans that more or less accommodate all of the challenges that we're going to face. Complex involves a degree of uncertainty in both the things that we understand, but also in the events that shape the project that creates emergent behavior. We can't predict everything that will happen. And so in a complex system, there are going to be some surprises along the way. And I guess I would go a step further and say that's different from a chaotic environment where, it's mostly surprises. That planning has a very limited value in managing a chaotic system.
I'd like to add too, in that he mentioned emergence and surprising, and that idea of listening is interesting for two reasons. In something like that, you like feedback loops, like a good engineer, to really calibrate and see what you're getting, and what you're getting is what you hope for. I think there's a sense of ongoing listening. Normally in a project, when you kick off a project, you have a pretty good understanding what's in it for everybody, and you think you've done your job of listening. But there may be value in continuing to listen as these emerging things happen to make certain, are you still getting what you thought you were getting? Do you still really care? Because I think that buy-in of all the stakeholders from the bottom up and across the board is probably periodically important to do, so that you're not merely managing data, you're actually involving and immersing yourself in the well-being and the interest of the other people.
It occurs to me that in these definitions, it is important to help tone down the idea that mega projects have to be big. The idea of, and distinction between complexity and complicated, I think is a much more important, nuanced element of this thing. Just like any system that is being built, normally there is a system that has to build the system. Think of a system like a car. So it's built of parts. But if you thought about Ford Motor Company as an example, there's a complete system embodied within Ford on how they go about building the parts. What we're talking about here that is really an important distinction is the system that's doing the building of the parts is what could be more complex than the thing that they're building by itself. Mm-hmm. And the causes of the schedule slips, the causes of the technical delays, the causes of all of a sudden no more support from the constituencies are effectively the complexity inherent in that system that is building the end objective. And I think those distinctions are important for us to remember.
From the systems engineer's perspective, I think of it as a system of systems. But from the program management perspective, I think of it as multiple projects and programs within the program. And I agree with you that what it takes to manage and maneuver and collaborate with all these systems and projects and programs is what makes it so difficult.
Well, and you think about, the classic tools that we have from both domains, from program management and from systems engineering, and they tend to be fairly mapped to predictable behaviors, right? And what we're describing here with emergent behaviors or unpredictable or unplannable events is that you need to have those tools because you're managing a complicated system, but you also need to have the organizational ability to adapt, right? And how do you have that? Well, you have leaders who can communicate the vision and allow the workforce, all of the programs, projects, and the people to adapt where necessary, where the situation on the ground requires them to adapt. You have to have communication so that people are constantly updated on where the status is and they're aware of what's happening in the environment. There are a number of behaviors that you have to build into the organization to manage this complexity. And so if you're not paying attention to the design of the organization in addition to the design of the thing that you're building, then you're going to be at a disadvantage.
I think there's an organizational psychology inherent in some of this too, because I think there are inherent disincentives to collaborate. So when I've experienced multiple companies and multiple people working together, the human tendency is to say, I'm not going to tell you all the things I might do that may hurt you, which means I don't tell you the interdependencies that we have, because if I don't tell you these interdependencies, you won't be checking on me and harassing me as to why I'm not getting this thing done that you need by Monday. If I can keep this a secret, I don't have to be overmanaged from my point of view, and I could be left alone to do my work, and I'll deliver it when I'm good and ready. But there's that sense of that disincentive to being open and honest and collaborative to reveal the true multiple interdependencies somehow has to be worked so that people feel welcomed and encouraged to actually do that disclosure and feel that they're together on that.
Mm-hmm.
You've been talking, for the last several minutes, communication has come up several times. On a mega project with all these entities and layers of entities and closely associated and more distant entities, if I'm working on a mega project, if I listen to everyone, I'm going to hear cacophony. If I listen to no one, it's absolute chaos. Where's the balance? How do you figure out what to listen to and not what to listen to?
I think the balance comes from having shared values. If you can agree on why you're doing this and agree on the outcomes, I think you become better able to work together and you become one team rather than fragmented teams. And just to comment on Chuck's comment on secrecy. Secrecy is bad for a large-scale program. You don't want secrecy. You want open systems. You want transparency. You're doing something that's never been done before. So it's very important to work together, understand what you know, but more important, understand what you don't know. So you know that you need to either develop that expertise or get the knowledge when it's not available within your program.
I think the nature of how you try to discover what's really important and what she said about shared values is important, because instead of going around the circle of all the companies and saying, I'm wanting to make certain you don't mess up and like make you put you on the defensive. If you have teams that are sort of oiling the works by saying, you know, I want to check in with you periodically to see what I can do to help you. And what are the things that you're fearful of that might put you behind? So instead of creating this cacophony that comes from conflict and an attitude that puts everybody at dis-ease amongst or discomfort amongst each other, to instead say, I'm here, I'm really wanting to help, and I'm making myself accountable to you to do just that and the things that are important to each of us. And so what's important to you today and what can I do to you, for you today, not do to you. Interesting how I said that. So, but I think that's something that can change, it sort of like, the attitude will make the difference. Is it cacophony or is it pleasant music? And I like music. So if you're singing sweet sounds, I'm wanting to hear it. If you are making cacophony because you're creating conflict or making me think that it's coming, then what would have been music I would have taken hours to listen to with joy suddenly becomes something I don't want to put up with for a moment.
Yeah, there are case studies that we've seen well-run programs for decades, and usually it seems like this is an anomaly, and it's attributable to the confluence of personalities, and but they have those characteristics of the leader, either the program manager or the more typically the leadership team, really developing a unity of purpose. And then communicating that throughout the program. And it's not a one-time event where you say, this is what we're going to do, see you later. It's, leaders go first. They're up there every day, communicating the vision to the team, reinforcing and enforcing the norms about how the people work together, how they communicate, how they collaborate. It's an ongoing effort to continue to shape and reinforce the behaviors that you want in the organization. And those are unique organizations when we see them and we marvel at them and then wonder, why can't all the organizations be like this?
When we talked on the phone the other day, you told me about some research you're doing, Eric, where you came up with 4 attributes of successful implementation of strategy. You talked about targets and right projects and funding and all that. Can you explain how that came about?
Sure. So I'm involved in a new research project at MIT, and we're collaborating with the Brightline Initiative, and the intent is essentially to bridge the gap between strategy development and implementation. Of course, implementation is where you get the benefits from the strategy, but it's the evidence is pretty strong that most organizations fail to implement strategy effectively, and they suffer as a result in terms of their financial performance and other things. And so we know a few things just based on lots of people studying strategy over the years, but and we're also trying to dive more deeply. But you think about the kickoff of a major project. They're going to have a project charter, and that becomes essentially the strategy for the guidance for the project. Now, who's involved in that? Who is helping to shape that? Are the people who are going to actually be implementing the strategy involved in that charter, meeting the targets involved? Are the people who are devising the strategy and the vision aware of the implementation challenges? That's where the conversation starts. But it doesn't just stop there. Then you have to pick the right projects and so forth. So we're on a journey to try to understand that process better, to actually get strategy implementation to become more effective in organizations.
This is interesting. When the strategy is being implemented, there's all these various entities working on it, trying to keep them together. Is there any one person in charge of a mega project that keeps it together, or is it more like the web, where nobody's in charge and it kind of happens?
I would never say no one's in charge. There's always someone in charge. And what happens on mega projects is that they're constantly evolving. So people do change their roles in the course of a mega project, and they also need to find and make sure that what they are doing is the right strategy. It's not just having a strategy, but also knowing when to change. And I think that is a major challenge of mega projects, knowing when it is time to change. And I'll give you an example. Many of the projects I've worked on are incentivized by speed. And if you're fast, you'll get rewarded. But fast isn't necessarily always best. We know that from our own driving. Fast is not best all the time. So we need to understand what is happening, and we need to know when it's time to change our strategy. And of course, our planning has to constantly be updated, because as Churchill said, planning's important, but plans are useless. So nothing is static in a mega project, and you have to recognize that and be aware of it all of the time. And you have to be relentless about making sure that what you're doing and how you're doing it is the right way. And that's where I think we need to focus on measuring our performance rather than measuring our speed.
But speed's kind of locked in with all these other criteria for the project, right? It's speed and it's cost and it's scope and quality. How do people designing a project find the balance across this? I mean, they're competing values in many cases.
They are, and that's where benefits come in. A mega project should be not just concerned about the iron triangle of project management, cost and schedule and scope, but they always should be looking at the benefits, and those benefits can evolve as the project progresses. When you start out, you may not realize you're not just building a road, but you're building a community, you're building an infrastructure, you're building a fiber optic cable system that's never been done before. You're also thinking about conservation. In California, on the new high-speed rail, they're worried about the cows. In Boston, we were worried about the fish life. So there's many things going on and many opportunities for benefits, and you don't want to miss them.
You know, it seems to me that we've introduced a couple of ideas that are all about team and the leadership within the team that needs to generate the trust, to have the space to be able to flow back and forth based on expertise, based on immediate knowledge, based on previous experience. If you take that type of team building and acknowledge that that has to be done to be able to allow fluidity through all of this evolution, then you have to complement this mind shift of complicated versus complex. It means that no longer do you think about the problem as I can define it within a very small box. I can plan it because I know exactly the resources and I know exactly the amount of time. And all I have to do is make sure that the parts are getting built, and then we slap them together. In complexity, it's like we think we know some general impression of the parts. We think that we know what success looks like, but the plan has to be able to accommodate the ideas of we think, and we're going to modify based on what we sense as we move forward within a trusted team that has the space to go, we're going in the wrong direction. How can we evolve to ensure that we as a collective body get there?
As we talk about the we, and there's a lot of we's in a mega project, so there's a lot of interfaces and boundaries between the different pieces. I can imagine an organization who's going to come up with a process by which they will manage those. It can be a light process or it can be an oppressive process. How much process is right and how much is too little and how much is too much as you're managing all this stuff?
I think there may be categories of that. So, for example, we have the world of process engineering, which understands all the processes and how they work across time and who's rewarded and all of that. Then you have project management skills, which are sort of different. And then you have the quality movement, and they embrace some of those things. And then you have that whole concept of innovation, you know, not only what brought you to this project in the first place with its underlying technology, but in all the complexity and uncertainty he was mentioning a moment ago. How do you reward and encourage people to be innovative in the moment to make certain that they can keep on track and listen to each other and get things done despite the apparent impossibility? And you have joy creating something out of nothing and creating order out of chaos and doing what everybody else thinks is the impossible. I think it's what it is to be created in the image of God. We act like that in some tiny little way and get to enjoy it. But I think all those qualities together can be mined for something. And I think is in our own communities, it's good to bring people who are from those different practice areas together to see what we can learn and apply somewhat simultaneously in that process. But I'd be interested in seeing what the others of you think about integrating that, because I know you've had a lot of progress in, or involvement in project management and that whole community, and maybe you may have some thoughts on that.
Well, I'll turn
go
to
ahead.
Eric. We've been working on a project together for several years, and have produced a book, and it's was quite an undertaking because we had to bring together program managers and systems engineers. So I'm going to defer to Eric to tell, as editor-in-chief, a little more about that project.
Well, editor-in-chief of a lot of talented editors and contributors from the PMI and COSI communities. So, and John was there at the very beginning of bringing these two communities together to try to solve some of these problems. So we focused on how to get the program management and systems engineering disciplines to work together more effectively. And we had a number of studies, surveys, interviews, and so forth, and came up with some fairly consistent results that when you get these program managers and systems engineers to work together more effectively in an integrated fashion, that you see higher performance. So better program outcomes, but you also see a kind of different nature of the working relationship together. That there is more of a shared vision, that there is a lot of the elements that have already been discussed so far in this panel, trust between the disciplines, an awareness of each discipline's contribution, and acknowledgement that, if I'm the program manager and this is a technical challenge, I'm going to have to rely on the systems engineer to tell me what the right answer is, because I don't have that depth. But you don't rely on just one discipline to solve all the problems. So we identified a number of characteristics of integration, and it really is a systems approach to managing these complex programs. You need to have the right tool sets and processes, because there are processes and ways of working that divide people and separate them. But there are also tools. You can have integrated information systems. And you can create standard work and a number of things that we talk about in our book that help people to come together and work together automatically. You have to create the right climate. The management has to set the vision and the tone for the way that the workforce interacts. You have to emphasize communication and collaboration. And then you have to have people that have the right set of skills. People don't automatically know how to collaborate and work together. And so you have to emphasize that. You may select people initially to bring those skills with them. But on a large project that could go on for years, there may be a significant training need to bring the entire project workforce up to the standards that you expect of them. So there are a number of things that you have to manage, and in some cases these could be a separate program within a program to manage all of these activities to make a high-performing organization. But that's kind of the work that Ginny and I have been working on for a while.
But what you're really talking about is changing corporate or organizational culture, right?
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of companies in the United States that don't have a great track record of successfully changing their culture. How do you go about that? I mean, if you decide you want to do it, how do you actually pull it off inside your organization?
Well, it helps if you've got some years to do it, right? It's consistent leadership and pursuing that vision. So we've seen some examples in the corporate side of organizations that have implemented these major reorganizations of the way they approach work. And it typically takes place over a number of years. We actually, in the book, because we felt that implementation and change was such an important part of bringing about this new culture of integration, that we devoted a part of the book to studying those organizations that had done it successfully. And one of the examples is BMW and their engineering division. They had a new strategy that they had to significantly improve their performance. And so the leadership of starting with the managing director for engineering at BMW and the executive circle started with this change program. They brought in people from human resources, organizational development specialists. They brought in the strategy consultants that they had inside the company, and then the leaders of the technical organizations. And they went through a number of defining a number of strategic projects, that were going to improve their productivity. They had bottom-up projects that engaged the entire workforce. They had a specific set of workshops that they used to reach out to the entire workforce. 8,000 people went through these workshops to teach this common vision of, where are we going and how do we work with each other. So, this was a significant program management effort within the organization. But over the period of 4 or 5 years, they were able to really achieve their strategic objectives and show those numbers that they were looking for. But in the process, they changed the way they work with each other.
You've got the book that you edited, and Ginny contributed to that significantly. Yes. Ginny also wrote the book on mega projects. And that was kind of a case study of the Boston
Yes, it
Big Dig,
was.
right? So how does the case study align with the concepts that Eric's talking about? Were they able to figure it out?
Well, it was very helpful to me after writing my book and then engaging in this project. What I learned was that integration in any form, but most important, integrating the people. We often think of integration as process and procedure and systems, but we forget the people. And one thing we did on the Big Dig, we should have done it sooner, but we did it, and we integrated 5 major employers. It was like a merger and acquisition all at once of 5 companies. And we had, some of us reported to managers that were not our own employer. And others reported to other managers that were not their employers. And I thought that was one of the turning points in the program because it allowed us to work with each other and realize we had a lot in common and a lot of shared values, one of them being we wanted to build the best quality project we could. So in working on the book with Eric and the other systems engineers and program managers, it was very encouraging to me to see the great need out there, because the study that was done early on reflected that 50% of the companies that were part of the survey had integrated, but 50% had not. So there was a lot of need out there and a lot of interest and a lot of recognition of the success that comes from integration.
Now, John, the book that Eric was editor-in-chief for came out of an alliance that you helped create when you were an INCOSE officer, right? Yes. The alliance between INCOSE and PMI and MIT. What drove your idea for that alliance?
Well, it's based on my experience. I grew up and was mentored by some extraordinary program managers and systems engineers in the 70s with very, very large space-based intelligence systems, very complex things. And back then, the norm was a tightly integrated, trusting team of program management and systems engineers. That was the norm. There was a shared value that we're in this together and that we will fail together if we don't acknowledge how to work as a team. Now, as a senior businessman in Booz Allen, I saw over the 90s, late 80s, the 90s, and in the first decade of the 2000s, that my customer, which was federal government, was writing more and more and more requests to award program management contracts or to award systems engineering contracts. It was the rare thing to see a customer want a program management and systems engineering integrated single contract. And time and time and time again, what I was witnessing was the conflict that was effectively starting all the way up at the customer level, in which they thought the way to get this job done is to go buy some program managers, okay, and tell them to get it done, and then go buy some systems engineers and tell them, you know, follow whatever is being said, and to generate a divide. There was no real team attitude. There was no common value perspective. And quite frankly, I felt that the community as a whole was suffering and would continue to suffer. So when I had the opportunity to become president-elect of NCOSE, and given the position that I was in at Booz Allen, I suggested to the board in November of 2010 that they support me in trying to approach PMI. And it was interesting. The first reaction wasn't wholeheartedly falling over themselves to do this. And when we walked ourselves through that, then when I used a contact that I had to go to PMI, that individual's reaction was, you know, they're not excited about this. And we went through a process of talking, and we got an agreement to sit down over lunch. And I thought long and hard about what is the core message that we ought to ask ourselves. Can we solidify a value proposition around? And so I thought that the customers are having a disservice because unintentionally, since the organizations are trying to make the best systems engineering message and the best program management message, that our customers are looking at the problem as an or. They need program management or they need systems engineering. Instead of, to get this job done, we need program management and systems engineering as an integrated thing. And so the message came out as, you know, we were going to move this from PM and SE to PM and SE, and that will be a higher delivery. That we tested that out in each of the constituent customer bases, and there was very, very strong feedback that yes, let's get this brought back in together.
They didn't resist the change?
The program management?
The companies?
The companies knew inherently something is broke, okay? And after all, if you think about it for a while, there are very few things in life that are simple, choose here or choose there. You know, if you've been around the block and you have scars from experience, you know that it's always a blend. And that means that it's always an and perhaps the debate is more about how much, but it's not about throwing one away and just keeping the other.
Has there been any thought about helping people develop multidisciplinary skills so that a systems engineer thinks more like a program manager and vice versa? So when they work together, they at least maybe speak some of the same vernacular and some shared vision.
Well, I think what's amazing, if we look at how we've evolved, how program management has evolved and systems engineering, we have more in common than we realize.
Right.
And one thing I did in writing the chapters, I looked at the standards that both organizations use, and there were so many overlaps. And I realized, you know, we really do a lot of things that in some ways are duplicative, but we could do them better if we shared our ideas. And I do feel this is a great opportunity to develop, and as you mentioned, skills. I wanted to learn more about systems engineering, and systems engineers wanted to learn more about program management. So it's just a great opportunity to enhance your own skills and to promote and develop your employees. And there's great rewards from doing that.
So the question I get often when I talk about this with audiences is, well, maybe we should just hire a program manager who used to be a chief systems engineer. So you get a 2-in-1 package, right? And I think at a certain scale that probably works very well, and it's been demonstrated in different organizations. But one of the challenges is, what if the scale that you're working at requires a really good program manager and a really good chief systems engineer, and you're asking one person to do 2 jobs that are hard? It won't work. Second thing is, if you rely on just one person to save the day, you're not building a team. You're not developing trust in the organization, the ability to collaborate and communicate. You're avoiding the social part of the solution by relying on just a single individual to do the integration work.
I have a question for the group.
Yes.
Have you yet, given all this wonderfulness, had a chance to create a crosswalk of standards and practices between the systems work and the project management work, so you can identify where those overlaps are, so that when the people train to do either one, when you do one, you're 3/4 of the way to the other? Or is that something that's yet to be done? Or is it not worth doing?
There's a start to the crosswalk in the book, so certainly we have looked at it. It needs to go further in depth, and I think that's a new project. That's another project, and I think it should be done. It's a great idea.
So, some people are starting to do the crosswalk as a result of the work that we've been doing over the last few years and the presentations that we've had at conferences. So I think people are getting the idea. I guess an observation that I'd like to make based on a question you asked a while ago about processes. If you have a strong emphasis on process, but the absence of leaders, then you have an oppressive system. If you have a strong emphasis on processes and enlightened leadership, then you have great capability for innovation and improvisation. And so I think a crosswalk would be great. Perhaps there may be opportunities for joint certifications, but I think we also need to develop the leaders and the mentalities and the social organizations to complement those.
Let's move to a slightly different topic. You used a phrase, Chuck, when we spoke the other day that I really like. You said we maximized efficiency by minimizing resiliency.
Yes.
Would you explain that, please?
Well, I think as a society, we just sort of gravitated towards this because we have subject matter expertise that's very diverse. I don't know how to change the brakes in your car, and I can't do brain surgery on your child. So I outsource that to everybody. And there's a certain amount of efficiency that comes from outsourcing. There's a certain amount of efficiency of working towards centralized systems. And I think in the byproduct of that as a society is we have inadvertently maximized efficiency by minimizing resiliency. And we don't have that balance in the system that says maybe we need some kind of 80-20 rule where we can take full advantage of centralized systems and all the things we outsource, yet at the same time retain some resilience because of the ability to be flexible and not so fragile. And I think the other part of that goes to the idea of what we assume by a mega project itself. Usually there's some huge problem that we are encountering for the first time, and we're daring to do something that's never been done before. That assumes a certain amount of creativity and awareness. And I think we need to back up and look at all of our mega projects and where we are as a society and ask ourselves, where are some of the remaining gaps about things that are left undone or where we find ourselves? And I think one of the things we need, in my own opinion, to do is to revisit how we have become far more fragile, and maybe we need to think through ways to do complex projects in a decentralized way that gives more responsibility and resilience in the parts. I don't know, that might be over-explanation,
No.
but...
That's great. I mean, we've had an example of resiliency lately. A few months ago, sadly, a pair of hurricanes came through the Caribbean and almost total destruction. There's now going to be a mega project to rebuild Puerto Rico. How do you plan a mega project when the results need to take effect this afternoon?
Well, that's a good question. And the planning should be starting now for every city and town in this country. And I've had the pleasure to hear many speakers here at the conference talk about community resilience. And we have to start focusing on that now. We really need to build resilient communities because it is the members of the community in the end that will be the first responders.
I think there's an interesting corollary to that, in that we have a lot of untested assumptions. And in our society, we've gotten so good at collaboration and mutual aid pacts and so on that we assume really big things don't happen. It's even inherent in how we do preparedness in our country. We basically give this message that says, nothing in the universe can touch you because you're an American, where we won't come and rescue you by 4 days. And that assumes a lot of resilience that's not there. So somehow we need to rethink, how we engage the whole process. And so I'll give you an example of hospitals. Hospitals across the country are much like Puerto Rico. Every hospital has a facilities-based disaster plan that says if I don't get water and if I don't get power, especially refueled diesel or diesel for my diesel generators, I just merely close up shop and send people down the street to the next hospital. 99.9% of the time, that's a perfectly good plan. But what happens when the day comes when the next 100 hospitals are simultaneously shutting down and sending everybody to you? Now, the end result is that we have these unthought through or accidental regional and national disaster plans, which are a compilation of these facilities-based plans, which result in something that sounds ludicrous, which is, as a society, we are committed to shutting down every hospital at the very moment we need them most. And it's not only true of hospitals, it's true of our National Guard. How are you going to call the Guard when the phones don't work? How does the governor keep command and control with the troops when we haven't built in the resilience to think these things through ahead of time? Even our faith-based institutions, what are you going to do? So we have to ask each of us in every aspect of society, are you committed to your values and to the service to your community that when times get really hard, you're going to not quit and go home? Well, if so, what do we have to do to rethink everything from our assumptions up as to how we pull that off and what kind of resilience do we need in our systems?
It's almost like an attitude and value adjustment exercise that needs to be done. But when you're starting the mega project under those conditions, at the very same time, the idea of a lot of detailed long-term plans, what the definition of detailed is and the definition of long-term probably is very, very different. Maybe a value proposition that says, how do we plan and generate objectives where we'll evolve? And we'll evolve where certain parts, we don't even know what the right implementation of certain parts are. Maybe it's microgrids in very, very small community areas that you then pull together. Or I'm sure in Puerto Rico, while I'm not 100% certain, but I suspect that they have a rather centralized power generation architecture right now. That might not be already, from a resilience point of view, that might show not the best and strongest path forward, but microgrids may not be the right answer either. There might be 5 or 6 instances of just simply generation that need to be tested quickly, discarded quickly, take the one thing that allows you to evolve from there, and ask what's the next priority. That type of attitude is a very, very different implementation. It needs a different implementation and meaning behind what am I planning? Okay, what is the definition of the objective? How do I propose to show the benefit, and then move to the next step?
I think you're right. When you're in the situation Puerto Rico is in now, it's a little unfair for us to say, do all of this all at once. They needed to have been doing this for some time. But I think there's always hope. One way around the problem of being overwhelmed and what I sometimes call pre-traumatic stress disorder is the idea of being able to take a really complex project like NCOSY would do, or like PMI might do, and break it up into meaningful parts. And what that does is allow you to do triage. You can, before despair locks you down and shuts you down, it's good to inject some hope right away and say, we can do some triage. There's some things we really can do now to make things better. It won't solve all our problems, but there's something we can do now. There's some other things we may put off for a while we can't concentrate on, it's too much, but there's a whole bunch of stuff in the middle. We can prioritize it, chunk it up and prioritize it and take meaningful steps at a time. And I think that's one of the things that folks at NCOSY and PMI bring, is that you can actually do that, and you can bring hope to people wherever they may happen to be and give them something they can do now as opposed to just giving up and dying or whatever you're going to do.
So it seems that what we're describing is at least initially a chaotic system where you don't understand what is happening in its entirety. And the first thing that you do in a chaotic system is try to stabilize it. Mm-hmm. And so you try to migrate from the chaos from a chaotic system to a complex system, because a complex system is easier to manage, right? And in a chaotic system, the way you respond is not by planning. The action is the planning, right? So you act. And what you're often relying on is the capabilities that exist within the location of the crisis, if you will, right? So the first responders are trained. There's a story from the Boston Marathon bombings of one of the runners just finished the race. The bombs went off, and this was a doctor and a combat veteran, and he ran to the explosion. I mean, most of us would be frozen because we don't know what to do. This is somebody who had combat experience and immediately ran into the fire, so to speak. And that's what our first responders do. They run into the fire. We rely on that capability. If we've invested in that capability, then we can start mitigating the effects of the chaos. It may not get us all the way from a chaotic system to a complex system, but if we get closer to a complex system, then the tools that we have for planning and analysis then have more impact. And we'd ultimately, I think, like to get to a complicated system. That's where we have the luxury of thinking through how we design the architectures of our systems. And we can do analysis to say, okay, what is the best electricity grids option for Puerto Rico, for instance? Or how do we plan regionally for hurricane events, especially in floodplain areas, where we may have combinations of disasters occurring at the same time?
We did an actual economic impact assessment of a chaotic event. The event was a total EMP laydown between south of Richmond to north of Baltimore, examined every SIC code, and looked at the mean time to repair or replace all the equipment necessary for large telecom systems, large power systems, and discrete electronics. And we were looking at modeling that very chaotic moment. And what we also discovered is when you try to gather yourself back and discover what's really working and so on, it takes a little time. So if you're flat on your back, it's like laying the hockey stick on the floor. And it takes a little bit of time to figure out what's going on so you can begin to get up that curve of the hockey stick to reconstitute yourself. And so what we simultaneously looked at is what would happen if we could anticipate an event like that and even, say, harden or protect 10% of the most critical assets. What would the result be? And what we noticed is if you protected even 10% of the most protected or most essential assets, you've actually moved yourself down in time across that hockey stick 3-4 or so months, so that instead of reconstituting from scratch, you're already up part of that hockey stick. And we showed that in low, medium, and high impact scenarios. In the medium impact scenario, you could avoid 80% of the economic loss if you were protecting 10% of the most critical infrastructure up front, and demonstrated with that being resilient for things you can't possibly imagine could have huge economic payoffs, so you don't have to fall into the total chaos. You can go back to the complex system issue.
Okay. I want to thank you. I've enjoyed myself immensely for the last hour. Thank you for being on the panel. Please thank our panelists.